I'd like to start with saying that one of the things that Catholic Church teaches is that we may believe in evolution, but we must also believe that there was one Adam and Eve from whom we are all descended from. This rule, however, doesn't rule out the possibility that there are other genetic ancestors as well, or other source of genetic difference as well. What makes Adam and Eve special is they are the first to whom God gave an eternal soul. So I'm going to read to you a passage from the book of Genesis that you should find interesting. The Nephilim appeared on earth in those days, as well as later, after the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of human beings, who bore them sons. All right, so first of all, the Nephilim is basically another word for giants. In some translations, it's actually just translated to giants. And the Nephilim are what you get when you mix the sons of God with human beings. And so the question came out, well, what does it mean by sons of God? And a lot of people have interpreted that to mean angels. But based on what we know of angels, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's not possible for angels to be attracted to humans. All right, so in order to understand what it means by sons of God, we need to follow one of the rules that Christians must follow in interpreting Scripture, is that we must always read Scripture in the light of Christ. And basically what that means, imagine you're reading some text message that somebody sends you, right? How you interpret that text is somewhat influenced by what you know of the person who sent the text. Right? So if you don't know the person, you might read it one way, but if you know some background about the person, it could influence how you interpret what you're being sent. And in the same way, Christians, we believe that God was the primary author of Scripture, but we also believe that Christ is God come to us in human form and in human nature. And so what that means is that since we've gotten to know Christ, God, then that should influence our interpretation of Scripture, even the Old Testament. So we go back and read the Old Testament in the light of Christ. And so when we talk about sons of God, well, what does Christianity say about sons of God? Well, we know that Christians are called sons of God. We're children of God by virtue of our baptism. When we're baptized, we receive grace from God, and by that we become sons of God. So going back to this, sons of God can very easily mean children of Adam and Eve, right? So that could be the case, right? So they would be children of Adam and Eve versus these other human beings who are not children of Adam and Eve. And some might say, well, the sons of God represent the people who are good, and the human beings represent the people who are bad. But what we're seeing here in this passage from Genesis is that we are getting biologically different creature, the Nephilim, from the merging of the sons of God and human beings. So that suggests that there were other beings besides children of Adam. All right, so another question that can come up about Genesis is the question, well, did people really live that long? If you read the genealogy accounts in the book of Genesis, you'll notice that they lived like hundreds and hundreds of years long. And then it got to this part of Scripture where it says, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not remain in human beings forever, because they are only flesh. Their days shall comprise 120 years. So the interesting thing about this particular passage from Scripture is this comes right before that passage where I mentioned the Nephilim from Genesis chapter 6, verse 4, but it's actually also sandwiched, this verse, Genesis 6, 3, is sandwiched between two verses that talk about the merging of the sons of God and human beings to create the Nephilim. And that has real significance. Whenever you see that in the Bible, one passage sandwiched between two others, it means, this one in the middle, this we say with the same line of thought as what came before and after. And so that speaks volumes about this passage when God says it. So, for example, in this passage, we know that God removing long life is being tied to this biological event, the sons of God marrying the daughters of human beings. And we also know from just reading the passage itself that the long life of these people was not due to biological factors, but to the spirit that God gave them, right? He says, my spirit shall not remain in human beings forever, and therefore, if God's going to remove his spirit, all of a sudden they have a normal lifespan. So it's the spirit of God that's giving them a long life. All right, so if we were to take the long life of these people metaphorically, that would tell us that these early people were much more holy than those that followed, right? And you can see the long life of these people start to taper off after a while, and it shows us that people became more and more evil at a point. One other point about this is that it starts to become biologically necessary to shorten human life when people start killing each other. So, for example, if you have somebody with a really long life, what you have to do is the person has to have children less often, right? Longer life means children less often, spread out much more far apart, because you don't want to overpopulate. And so if you introduce people starting to kill each other, you cause a problem, because you can very easily end somebody's life before they reproduce, and you start losing genetic diversity. And so you have to compensate for that, people need shorter lives and more frequent children. All right, so anyway, so let's get on to the last question I want to address is, did the flood, Noah's flood, really happen? First of all, it's important to note that the flood draws upon the ancient Mesopotamian story of the Great Flood. And in ancient Mesopotamia, flooding was actually really common. Most of the time, they'd have small floods. Every once in a while, a bigger flooding. Every once in a while, a huge flood. And so, the bigger it is, the rarer the flood happened, which is just the way that nature works, right? So the smaller floods are more common, bigger floods are less common. So it's possible that they had one really big one. Another point about the story of Noah's flood, it talks about how the whole earth was covered in floodwaters, and every life was killed, right? But when we hear the word earth, we think about big round planet, right? We see earth very different than the people who wrote this story. At the time of these people, at the time of Noah, what was earth was just what was visible to them, right? So I'll give an example. In science, we talk about scientists talk about the size of the universe, right? But the size of the universe is actually metaphorically, it's short for saying size of the visible universe. Actually, scientists know that there's stuff beyond what we can see, at the edge of the universe, but they don't usually talk about that. They talk about the size of the visible universe because that's what we can see. And the same case was with Noah. And another example, we might say, say somebody's house burns down, right? What's the person going to say? The person going to say, the fire destroyed everything. Well, did the fire destroy absolutely everything in the whole universe? No, it didn't. But the fire destroyed the person's whole world. So that's, you take that in context. And so it's not contrary to Scripture to say that the flood was regional to Noah's world. I'm going to read this little passage here. This is interesting. This takes place during the time of Moses, long after the flood. So some people were telling Moses this. There we saw the Nephilim, the Anakim are from the Nephilim. In our own eyes, we seemed like mere grasshoppers, and so we must have seemed to them. So, if the descendants of the Nephilim were around after the flood, then how did the flood destroy every life except for Noah and his family? So we see there evidence in the Bible that it didn't actually destroy every life. So one other thing is, what if we were to take the flood in Noah's story figuratively? Well, if we take it figuratively, what we can do is look at how the Bible sometimes figuratively uses the phrase many waters, where when it talks about the many waters, sometimes it's talking about large numbers of people. And my guess is the reason that metaphor came to be about is when a lot of people would gather together and they're talking to one another. If you listen to them, they probably sound like the waves of the ocean. But anyways, the many waters is sometimes a metaphor for many people. So if you were to interpret it that way figuratively, it turns the story of the flood of Noah into the story of people like killing each other and wiping each other out, even wiping out their animals and crops that they can't live. And so, in that case, God, foreknew this and rescued Noah as well as the animals. So, anyway, so that's to address some of the interesting stories in the book of Genesis. Just remember that all of these are figurative language describing primeval events, and they are all an expression of God's love for us. So, there you have it, and may God bless you.